Somebody needs to ring the bell. Ring the bell. Good morning, everyone. I had to laugh because last week it rained, and we talked about, nobody's going to come because it's raining, and then today it's sunny, and everybody said, I hope people come because it's sunny. I was like, I didn't know the weather was so important here. It apparently is. So I am Kathy Ridge, and I'm going to be teaching on chapter 9 today in the Gospel of John. And I know I do this every week, so I'm really repetitive about this, but I never know who's watching online. Well, actually, I know my mom watches, so hi, Mom. But this may be your first time joining in today online, so I want you to know that if you're watching, you can make a comment on Facebook, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can make a comment there, or you can also email our what's her called? An admin leader, Darlene, and this is her email address. And then we'll know, or she'll know that you're with us, and we can count you here as joining us. And if you want to get the handouts, which I give out with some of the lessons, you can also email Darlene and let her know that, and we'll be sure that she gets those sent to you. I want to give you all a heads up as we look ahead that we won't be meeting during spring break, and that's on March 16th. So no class on March 16th. But after we return on March 23rd, we'll continue on through May 11th. Then we'll break for the summer. So that's kind of just a quick glimpse ahead. All right, so I'm going to pray before we start. So if you'll pray with me, or at least bow your heads, and I'll do the praying. How's that? Father, you are a good God, and you're a God of purpose, and you're a God of order. And in the middle of this chaotic life that we live, you bring us stability and strength. And so I'm going to ask you this morning to give each of these women insight and understanding into your word so that they can lean into your strength. I know that you have a message for each one of them, Father, and so I ask your blessing on the teaching, and that it conforms to your will, and that you will protect me from wandering away from any of your truths, that I'll stick with them in every way. I ask you to fill me so that I speak your words and not mine. I ask this for your glory and for the fame of your name in the nations. In Jesus Christ, amen. All right, so I'm going to start out with kind of a strange statement, and that is that it's really hard to be a Christian in America today. In some ways, it's harder to be a Christian here than it is to be one in the Middle East or in China or in Russia or any of those places in the world where Christians are persecuted and they're executed for their beliefs. And that's because here in America, we have a good life. We do. Our country has the largest economy, and our residents have the most disposable income, more than any other country. Our culture revolves around the concept of the American dream. We all believe that if we work hard and we persevere, we can attain our dreams, and we all expect to be able to have the freedoms and the opportunities to be able to do that. It's really who we are as Americans. And unless you grew up in another country, it's as much a part of who you are as the breath that you breathe. And because of that, as American Christians, we believe, even if it's subconsciously, that if we serve God well, if He'll reward us with a good life. We think, I'm doing everything you ask of me, Lord, and then expect that He'll give us the life that we dream of. And when something happens that derails our dream, we cry out, why, Lord? I've loved you and I've served you and I've been obedient to you. Why is this happening in my life? Our culture has ingrained in us a belief that we can control our life, that if we do the right things and we work hard, we have it in our power to control and direct our destiny. And that bleeds into our Christian beliefs as well, whether we recognize that or not. But the reality is that the human experience is full of pain and difficulty and struggle and disappointment. There's not one of us that escapes feelings of frustration and grief and sorrow. Suffering in this life is inevitable, and every person, every Christian will experience trials of some kind. That's scriptural. Jesus told us, in this world you will have trouble. And Paul said, we are hard-pressed, perplexed, persecuted, struck down. And we see the same message in the Old Testament. The righteous person will have many troubles. And many of us know these verses, and we believe them. But we're still shocked when we get the diagnosis or experience the loss or feel the pain that disrupts our good life. We immediately forget, in the face of terrible suffering, that we're guaranteed to suffer in this world. Why? Because sin has infected everything in our world, and nothing escapes its destruction. But also because suffering is part of being a Christian. Friends, don't be surprised at the painful trial you're suffering, as though something strange were happening to you. But we are surprised. We ask why. I don't understand. Why didn't you act? Why didn't you intervene? We feel lost and abandoned. Some African pastors were in the United States for a conference, and during their free time they wanted to do some shopping so they could pick up some of those things that were easy to get here but were hard to find in their country. And so before they headed out, their host gave them his phone number just in case something came up and they needed him. And it wasn't long after they left that the host's phone rang, and it was the pastors, and they were lost. And so the host told them to go to the nearest intersection and tell him the names of the two streets. And so the pastors walked to the intersection and told the host, we're at the corner of Walk and Don't Walk. But that's how suffering makes us feel. We're lost, and everything feels unstable, as if our foundation has come out from underneath us. We don't know which way to turn, or even if there is a way to turn. We don't know if we should walk or don't walk. Do we stay put and hunker down, or do we get up and run? We're hurt and we're confused, and all these feelings come because we just don't understand why we're in this place of suffering. We don't know why we have to experience it or what it's supposed to accomplish. And all those questions we ask go unanswered, because most of the time we never get detailed answers to our why questions. I doubt I'll ever know this side of heaven the details about why I'm having to walk the road of suffering through losing my son. My mind wants to reject the idea that there's a reason good enough to justify his death, because I hate the suffering and I don't understand it. But here's the thing. I may not know the details about the reasons why this is the path God has put me on. But I do know God, and I know his word. And God tells me through his word that there are some big picture reasons for my suffering. He tells me that he permits suffering because he has purpose in my suffering. For a little while, you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. This idea of purpose in our suffering is so critical. It brings meaning into the incomprehensible, and it brings structure into the chaos. It makes something intolerable into something we can accept when we recognize that there's a point to it all. In the 1500s, there was a Protestant minister. His name was John Philpott, and he defied the Catholic Church and defended the Reformation, which was the movement that started the split between the Protestant and the Catholic Church. He was given several chances to recant of his beliefs, but he refused to do so, and he was finally sentenced to death by being burned at the stake. And when his sentence was announced, he said, I'm ready. God grant me the strength and a joyful resurrection. And he walked to his place of execution on his own without having to be dragged to it. And when he reached it, he knelt and he kissed the stake that he was to be tied to while he was burned. Can you imagine having the kind of faith like that? That when suffering and trial happens, we have no doubts, no questions, no hesitancy about going through them. Well, here's the irony of that. That kind of faith only comes through the testing of trials and suffering. It's in our suffering that we learn our self-sufficiency is a lie and that God is the only one who is dependable and trustworthy. See, the trials that we go through, the suffering that we experience, they're like building blocks. Every time we successfully navigate through one, our trust in God grows. And as we see his faithfulness and we experience his care and his mercy and his power, we see that he carried us when we couldn't continue on our own and that he was true to keep his promises. And we see the depth of his love for us. Those are things that we can't learn when we're content and complacent and living the good life. When life is easy, we don't need God so much, right? When we're living the good life, our faith tends to grow stagnant. It doesn't move much. But have a trial with deep suffering come along and watch it take off. The reality is that suffering is part of living the good life because God uses it for his glory and for our good and for the good of others. So let's take a look at our study this week and we'll see how that's illustrated in chapter 9. As the chapter opens, we have to look at that at the opening as a continuing of the narrative. The chapter break was inserted long after it was written, so we have to read this in context with the end of chapter 8. And when you do that, you see that Jesus slipped away from the Jews who wanted to stone him in the temple grounds, and he continued on his way. And there's no sense that he was anxious or in a hurry or in any other way disturbed by the deadly confrontation he had just walked away from. And as he went, he and his disciples came across a blind man, a man blind from birth, and probably one of the many beggars that begged outside the temple gates. The disciples noticed him too, and they must have been somewhat familiar with him because they knew he had his condition from birth, not as the result of an accident or from an illness. But they didn't really see him as a person, as someone to offer help to or even have a conversation with. They saw him as an object of an interesting theological question. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, Jesus saw the man differently. He saw a suffering human being who needed a transformed life, which of course is how he sees all of us, right? But first, he took a moment to address the wrong thinking of his disciples. It was a widely held belief in ancient times that suffering in general, and especially suffering that came from disabilities, was a result of a person's sin or their parents' sin. And this belief was so ingrained in the culture that the disciples actually asked if the man had sinned in the womb and had been born blind as a result. Rabbi, did this man sin that he was born blind? Jesus didn't let that idea stand. He corrected it immediately. He said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. And he wasn't saying that the man and his parents hadn't ever sinned. He was responding directly to the disciples' question that about the source of the man's suffering. It is true that our sin can cause suffering. It does cause us personal suffering often, our sin. But Scripture is clear in saying that not all suffering is caused by the sin of the person or their parents. The whole book of Job shows that suffering comes to the most obedient and faithful of people. Suffering is part of God's purpose. And that's what Jesus said about this man. This man's blindness wasn't because of sin. It happened so that the power of God could be displayed in his life. And when you read that, it seems a little harsh about God until you really look at what Jesus said. See, he didn't say the power of God would be displayed by his life. He said it would be displayed in his life. And that means the display of power wasn't for the rest of the world. It was for the man himself. His blindness wasn't some object lesson to be callously used by God so that people could see God's power. The suffering was for the benefit of the man. He would see in his own life God's great and merciful power to transform him. And yes, the world would see what happened and they'd be affected by it too, but that would eventually bring this man to saving faith. God always puts purpose in our suffering. He works in and through it for our good. So, see, the question shouldn't have been why the suffering. It should have been how will God use it? What good work of God will come out of this suffering? And Jesus himself felt the urgency of that good work. He understood in ways that his disciples didn't yet. The opportunities that he had for him to transform lives wouldn't last forever. And so he said, we need to do the work of the one who sent me while it's still day. And Jesus knew his time on earth was limited, and he was feeling the time slip by. It had been a long day, teaching the crowds and then debating with the Jews in the temple courts. And by now it must have been close to evening. So Jesus uses, again, things from his surroundings to teach the disciples. It's still day, but night is coming. And when the night comes, the time for work has passed. It's imagery for life and death. While Jesus was still alive as a man on earth, it's still day, but his death was coming soon, which would end his earthly ministry. But until that time came, while he still walked the earth, he was the light of the world. See, he repeated back what he had said back in chapter 8, which was earlier in the day for him, that he's the light of the world, and he's the one who overcomes darkness. Because there was a man trapped in physical and spiritual darkness right there in front of them. And so Jesus made mud by spitting on the ground, and he put it on the man's eyes, and then told him to go wash them in one of the pools in the city, the pool of Siloam. It's a strange way to perform a miracle, using mud and spit, but it's very compassionate in its own way. A blind man would have had no way of seeing the expressions on Jesus' face, or any gestures he might have made with his hands. So the weight of something tangible on his eyes would have made it easier than if Jesus had simply spoken to him for him to respond in faith. Because notice, Jesus didn't promise him that he'd be healed. He just applied the mud and said, go wash. But the action of putting the mud on the man's eyes implied that it was medicinal in some way. And the man did respond in faith. He went and washed, and then he went home with his sight restored. Well, this set off all kinds of confusion with his neighbors. Wait, isn't this the blind guy who begged outside the temple gates? Some of them thought so, but others couldn't believe it. They claimed it was just someone who looked like that guy. But the man himself said, no, really, it's me. And the people were both skeptical and astounded. Well, if it's you, how can you see? This kind of healing had never happened before. There's no biblical record of a person born blind and then being healed of their blindness before this. Not by any prophet, not by any priest, or any disciple. Nothing in the Old Testament scriptures. And so the people struggled to believe what had happened. But there was no denying that the man, blind from birth, could see now. The man called Jesus by name when he answered their questions. He said, the man they called Jesus did it. He made mud and put it on my eyes and then had me wash in the pool. And then I could see. And you can practically see him throwing his hands up in the air like, I have no idea how he did it. And then when they wanted to know where to find him, he told them he didn't know where Jesus was either. But he saw the glory of God at work in his life. And the disciples saw God's glory. And the man's neighbors and acquaintances saw God's glory. None of that would have happened if the man hadn't been born blind. So God used it for his purpose. He used it to bring glory to himself. And that's the first truth. Our suffering glorifies God. Our suffering glorifies God. So let me clarify that a little bit. There's nothing about suffering that is glorifying to God in itself. Grief doesn't glorify God. Pain doesn't glorify God. Death and illness and injury don't glorify God. What glorifies God is God's response to that suffering and the believer's response to it. God's glory is revealed when he relieves our suffering. He can and does meet us in the midst of the storm, and he gives us hope and help. He can and does heal us. He can and does remove the cause of our suffering, or change our circumstances, or pull us out of difficult situations. He does this in his timing and in his way. Sometimes it's a true miracle for everyone to see, like the blind man. Sometimes he does it privately, just for you. Sometimes it's shortly after your suffering begins, and sometimes it's after a long season of suffering. Sometimes it goes just like you think it should go, and sometimes his response is nothing like what you wanted. But always his response to your suffering is the perfect response, in the perfect timing, for your perfect good and for his perfect glory. But our response to our suffering brings him glory too. When we respond to suffering in a way that shows the world that Christ is sufficient, that he's the source of our strength and comfort, that he's the one we find our hope in, that he's greater than the temporary troubles of this world, then God gets the glory. As the unbelieving world watches, God is glorified by our ability to stand fast when it seems like we should crumble, when we praise him, when it seems like we should protest. Jonathan Darville is a Christian author who's been battling the effects of Lyme's disease for over 10 years, and he wrote about this very topic of suffering not too long ago. These are his words. My wife, Jillian, and I were eating in the parking lot of Chick-fil-A, and she was patiently listening to me as I was wrestling to make sense of what has been happening to us in the last month. I, a gainfully employed and well-fed American, was diagnosed with starvation and had a line put in for a feeding tube. I began losing my ability to walk. Apparently, the years of treatment had destroyed my body's ability to digest and absorb nutrients. I dwindled down to 110 pounds, and I was told that I almost didn't make it. For the second time in my life, I have recently had to walk away from a career and a home to focus on my health. In a poignant moment, my wife stopped and she looked at me and said, "Honey, I've been thinking about this. And if you could bring God more glory right now by being healthy, then guess what? You'd be healthy, but you're not. So apparently you can bring God more glory right now by being sick." That was the most comforting thought that she could have shared with me in that moment. It silenced me. It stopped the bleeding. Not only was my suffering under the sovereign control of our great God, but it was being used for his greater glory. God says, "See, I have refined you. Though not as silver, I have tested you in the furnace of affliction. For my own sake, I do this." And maybe that makes you think God is cruel and egotistical to use our suffering to glorify himself. But if you think that, then you don't understand that everything in creation is about God and his glory. Listen to these words from Isaiah. He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them like a tent to live in. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground, than he blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. To whom will you compare me? Who is my equal, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all of these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great and mighty power and strength, not one of them is missing. Why do you complain? Why do you say, "My way is hidden from the Lord, my cause is disregarded by God"? Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. That's who God is. But us, we're dust. The life of mortals is like grass. They flourish like a flower in the field. The wind blows over it, and it's gone, and its place remembers it no more. Ladies, it's not about us. It's all about him. So if we're tempted to complain about God using our suffering for his glory, we have a wrong view of God. We've put ourselves in a higher position than God. Because even if he was cruel and egotistical, he's still God, and we're still not. But he isn't cruel and egotistical. When Moses asked God, "Show yourself to me," God revealed the back of himself to Moses, and as he passed by Moses, he gave a description of himself. He called himself the Lord, the compassionate and gracious Lord, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to the thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. God isn't cruel. He's compassionate and gracious and forgiving, and he loves us. What he uses for his glory, he also uses for our good, because that's his character. He loves us, and he's for us. He wants the very best for us, and he does what's necessary for us to gain that very best. Our good and his glory, those are always his highest concerns. Okay, so let me take a drink. So let's get back into it in the second section, verses 13 through 34, and this part covers the Pharisees' response to the healing, and we aren't surprised, of course, to find out that they really aren't on board at all with it. The healing happened on a Sabbath day, and when the formerly blind man was brought before the Jews by his neighbors, he was questioned by them to find out exactly what Jesus did to restore the man's sight. When they found out, it included what they would consider work. Some of them said, "Well, this man isn't from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath." Others of them were more practical, and they said, "Well, come on, how could a sinner do miracles like that?" And they all pondered who Jesus was and tried to figure out what to make of his power to heal. But no one had an answer. And so they turned back to the man and asked him what he thought. After all, it was his eyes that were opened, so maybe he could give them some clarification. And the man thought about who Jesus was, and he came back with a theory. Well, he's a prophet. That wasn't helpful or insightful enough for the Pharisees. They couldn't even bring themselves to believe his story, because to believe it would mean to acknowledge Jesus for who he was. And so they brought his parents in and questioned them. "Is this really your son? Is this the one you say was born blind? Well, if that's true, then how is it possible that he can see now?" Well, a parent knows their child, obviously, and so they confirmed that yes, he was their son, and that yes, he had been blind since birth. But they had no opinion to offer about how he could see now, nor about the one who had given him his sight back. They were afraid to speak their mind because they knew Jesus was out of favor with the Pharisees. They thought they might know who he was, but anyone who suggested that he might be the Messiah was expelled from the synagogue. That would mean being cut off from their friends and family, from their community, and their ability to worship God. So they tossed the responsibility back on their son, basically threw him under the bus, and said, "Ask him. He's of age, and he can speak for himself." So the Pharisees brought the man back before them and told him to speak the truth before God, to confess what had happened, admit that Jesus was a sinner, not a prophet. But the more he was put under pressure by the Jews, the more he began to really consider who Jesus was. He became bolder, and he refused to recant his story. Well, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. But one thing I do know for sure, I was blind, but now I can see. The irrefutable fact in front of them was that the man had been blind, but wasn't anymore. They couldn't argue with that. Yet they wouldn't allow themselves to believe, so the Pharisees demanded that he tell them his story of what happened again, hoping to find a discrepancy in what he said. But the man refused. He said, I've already told you, and you didn't believe me. Why do you want to hear it again? And then he added a comment that was both a mockery of the Pharisees, and it was a confession that he would follow Jesus. Do you want to become his disciples too? I think that's a brave thing to say, considering how much power these men had to ruin his life and his future. But I also think about what he had just experienced. I might not have been intimidated either if I'd just been the recipient of a miracle like that. Jesus had just done the impossible and given him his sight back. Really, these men and their intimidation and their fear tactics were unimportant and inconsequential in light of that. But true to form, the Pharisees fully rejected the man's decision to follow Jesus. They were derogatory, and they said, you might be his disciple, but we're disciples of Moses. We know for sure that God spoke to Moses. We have no idea where this man even comes from. The man's response showed that he'd fully considered now who Jesus was. I always have to talk something out in order to work through it, and this reminds me of that. He was able to work through the overwhelming implications of this miracle he'd experienced. He must have been in shock, but talking it out helped him. And as he spoke about it with the Pharisees, as he defended himself before them, he now had greater clarity. And he replied with great insight, this is amazing. You claim to know nothing about him, but the fact is, he opened my eyes. It's well known that God doesn't give power like this to sinners, but he does listen to anyone who lives in reverence of him and does his will. No one has ever heard of a man born blind being able to see again. Never has this happened. If this man didn't come from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything, let alone heal me. And these Jews never did take criticism well or a logical argument that made them consider that Jesus might be who he said he was. So they lashed out at the man, and they implied that he had been cursed by God because of his sin. And then filled with rage at the man and by their inability to refute his testimony, they threw him out. And that may mean that he was thrown out of their presence, but it's more likely that it means that he was expelled out of their synagogue. But it doesn't matter. He'd encountered the living God in Jesus Christ, and he was forever transformed. That encounter pointed his neighbors and acquaintances and his parents and the Jewish leaders to Jesus too. His suffering had highlighted Jesus and all his power and mercy. Our truth for this section is our suffering points others to God. Our suffering points others to God. So the world watches how we as Christians suffer. And nothing is as compelling and attractive to an unbeliever than a believer who suffers well. And what does that mean, to suffer well? It means clinging to his promises, treasuring him, holding him close, and praising his name when life is falling in on you. Joni Eareckson Tada, who was paralyzed from the neck down in a diving accident as a teen, says, we're made for one purpose, and that is to make God real to those around us. The reality of God's power and his love and his character are made very, very real to a watching world when we trust him in our pain. And have any of you seen videos from Nick Vujicic? Yeah, he's a Christian evangelist and he's a speaker who was born without any arms or legs. He talks about his life on his website, and his story is pretty inspiring. He wasn't accepted by the other kids at school when he was a kid, and he was struggled always to figure out why God, if he really loved him, would make him the way he was. He felt like maybe he'd done something wrong in God's eyes. He thought about suicide often as a kid, until one day when he was about 15 years old, he read this story that we're studying today of the blind man. He was transformed by what Jesus said, this happened so that God might be displayed in his life. He put his faith and trust in Jesus at that point. And today he's a 38-year-old husband. He has a wife and 4 kids, and he speaks all over the world about how God transformed his life. And here's a quote from him. Due to the emotional struggles I experienced with bullying and self-esteem and loneliness, God began to instill a passion of sharing my story and experiences to help others cope with whatever challenge they might have in their lives. Turning my struggles into something that would glorify God and bless others, I realized my purpose. The Lord was going to use me to encourage and inspire others. Now I'm fully convinced and understand that other people see his glory as he uses me, just the way I am. See, our faith in the midst of suffering is like a beacon of light in a dark world. Everyone understands our pain and suffering when they see it. That's something they can relate to. But not everyone understands and relates to our response to our suffering. Our response is baffling to some, but it compels them and it draws them in to investigate. They ask, where does she get this attitude of hope and thanksgiving when she's suffering so much pain? And I'm not saying that everyone comes to saving faith when they come in closer to investigate. I mean, look at the Pharisees. They were drawn in to consider who Jesus was by the blind man's suffering and his deliverance. But some still said, this man isn't from God, and they rejected him. But they were compelled to dig into it. They were pointed to God by it. See, our suffering has a missional element to it. It draws others in to find out where our strength comes from, where our hope comes from, when we navigate through the troubles of this life with patience and praise. When the car breaks down, or the job is lost, or the diagnosis is grim, or the marriage crumbles, or the loved one dies, it's compelling when we lift our faces up to the Lord and lean into him. It's our faith while suffering. That's what makes God look trustworthy and appealing to an unbelieving world. When my friend Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer, she immediately turned to Jesus as her helpmate through it. She used Facebook as a platform to document her walk through all the parts of her illness, the chemo and the hair loss, the double mastectomy, the reconstruction. And she always expressed hope and a total dependence on Jesus. The comments people have made on her posts are full of questions and observations about her faith. One said, "You always seem so optimistic. Don't you ever get discouraged? I get that you have faith, but is that really enough?" Another person commented, "I can't even imagine going through what you're going through, but you make it seem so easy. I wish I had faith like yours." See, her suffering made them consider, to want to investigate the source that she leaned on so heavily. Her suffering pointed people to Jesus. We have one more section that talks about how our suffering helps us. So let's get back into the chapter at verse 35. At some point after the man's confrontation with the Jewish leaders, after he was thrown out of the synagogue, Jesus sought him out. And when he found the man, he asked, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And Son of Man was the most common title that Jesus used for himself. And by using it, he identifies himself with us, the human beings that he came to save. But it also refers to the Messiah. The Old Testament prophet Daniel used the same phrase when he was speaking about the Messiah. He said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority and glory and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will never pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." And the man Jesus had healed maybe understood the reference to the Messiah, but he was kind of unsure who Jesus was referring to. "Well, who is he, sir? Who is the Messiah? Tell me so that I can believe in him." And Jesus gave him a direct and unmistakable answer. "He's right in front of you. In fact, you're talking to him. It's me." And with that, the man's faith came to completion. He had started out by calling Jesus a man, and then he called him a prophet, and then someone from God, and now he called him Lord. Lord, I believe. And he worshiped Jesus. And what Jesus said next sounds like it contradicts what he had said in an earlier chapter, that he didn't come to condemn or judge the world, but to save it. But this isn't a contradiction when he says here that it's for judgment that I have come into the world. What Jesus is saying is that by coming, he divided the world into those who believe and those who don't believe. He forced a choice by coming, a choice to choose him or reject him. And in a sense, that is a judgment. Because while those who believe will see spiritually and they'll understand, those who reject him will become spiritually blind. And some Pharisees who were standing there with him heard what he said and asked him, "Does that mean you're calling us blind?" Jesus, with great compassion, spoke truth. He said, if you were blind, if you'd never heard the gospel message I bring, you wouldn't be guilty of sin. But you have heard it, and you've rejected it. You claim to have great spiritual enlightenment, but you don't. But you've heard the good news, and so you're still accountable for your sin. Doesn't get any clearer than that. He told them that they have no faith, and they're lost in the darkness of their sin. But the man who had suffered a lifetime of blindness was a striking contrast. They interrogated him, and his faith grew. They threw him out of the synagogue, and he came to saving faith. In the middle of a pretty tumultuous time in his life, he saw his Lord, and he worshiped him. So that's what suffering does. Our suffering grows our faith. Our suffering grows our faith. And it maybe sounds contradictory or contrary that suffering grows faith, but it might help to think about your muscles. If you want to get stronger, you have to push your muscle fibers to the breaking point, literally to the point of pain and damage. You feel sore and stiff afterwards, but as your body repairs those damaged fibers, it fuses them together and increases their size and strength. The stress you put on your muscles makes you stronger, not weaker. It's the same with your faith. When it's tested and stretched to the breaking point through pain and suffering, faith gets stronger, not weaker. James says we should consider it pure joy to face trials because the testing of your faith develops perseverance so that you may be mature and complete. God allows us to experience the soreness and stiffness of suffering in order to mature and strengthen our faith. Paul experienced that over and over on his missionary journeys. In one of his letters to the believers in the city of Corinth, he wrote, "We don't want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships that we have suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God." See, there was purpose in Paul's suffering. God used it to turn Paul away from faith in himself, faith in his own abilities. He brought Paul to the point of death so he would grow in his dependence and trust in God. God wants us to grow in our belief, our conviction, our confidence that he's all we need. That's the journey that we're on as we move through this life. We're growing in faith, and it's in the journey that we grow. People who climb mountains do it because they want to test their courage and their physical stamina and their mental strength. If all they wanted to do was get to the summit, they could just take a helicopter to get up there. But the value for them is in the climbing. It's the pain and the misery of getting up the mountain that requires them to find the inner mental and physical reserve to reach the reward of the summit. And that's the same for us too. It's in the climb, the hard and rocky places, that we come to the end of ourselves and discover God is there, helping us and holding us, working for our good. And we begin to understand that God has a different definition of good than we do. Our good is pleasant and enjoyable. His good is whatever brings us closer to Jesus and causes us to be more like him. When Michelangelo made his famous sculpture of David out of a block of marble, he chose a stone that had been rejected by other artists. It was too flawed. But Michelangelo saw what that marble could become, and so for over 2 years he chipped away at the marble, chiseling away all the flaws. And eventually all that chipping revealed the image of David that Michelangelo had seen inside that flawed block. But if you could ask the block of marble, it might tell you it didn't love being chipped at, that the process wasn't pleasant. In fact, it hurt. But even so, it submitted to the chisel because it knew that Michelangelo was making something beautiful out of it. And I know I'm personifying a piece of marble here, but I'm doing it to make a point because we too are called to submit to the chisel, the one held in the hand of our Creator God. He's forming us, chipping away the flaws and weaknesses to reveal the image of the Lord Jesus Christ within us. And we don't really like the process. It's unpleasant. It hurts. But we're being transformed into his likeness. It would have been a tragedy if Michelangelo had quit turning that block into the image of David before he finished because it was painful for the marble. And it would be tragic if God were to stop forming us into the image of Christ before he was finished because we didn't like suffering through trials. We need to hold on to that concept. When the hard times come, when the pain has us on the ground, when we think we're at the end of our endurance, we need to hold on to the truth that God is using our suffering for a purpose. He's chipping away our flaws. He's purging our sins, strengthening our commitment to him, disciplining our mind, imparting wisdom, increasing trust, fostering hope, forcing us to depend on him. In other words, he's growing our faith. He doesn't want to give us a good life. He wants to give us the goodness that comes from a deep and abiding faith. So if suffering is the road that you're walking right now, then hold fast to the knowledge that God will use it for good in your life, and he'll never leave your side. He won't take his eyes off you even for a moment. So rise up, put one foot in front of the other. Walk the road he's put before you, confident in the knowledge that you don't suffer without purpose and you don't suffer alone. Let's pray. God, you are great and mighty, a sovereign God, and yet you lean down your face low and listen to us and to our concerns, and you tenderly care for us. Would you help us to see your purpose in our suffering and believe that you always work for our good? Would you help us to suffer well so that the eyes of the world will see you in us? And I ask in the name of your suffering Son, who knows our every tear and holds them in his hand. Amen.